What transforms a military setback into a legend of terror that haunts commanders for years? In April 1941, a fortress that British strategists considered impregnable fell in less than 2 days to a force that should never have reached it. The garrison at Mechili, positioned deep within Libya's unforgiving desert, was defended by battle-hardened troops, supported by artillery, and commanded by experienced officers who had tasted victory against Italian forces just months before. Yet when Erwin Rommel's Africa course arrived at its gates, something unprecedented unfolded. Something that would fundamentally alter how Allied commanders perceived desert warfare and the German general who seemed to rewrite its rules with each passing day. The fall of Mechili was not merely a tactical defeat. It represented the shattering of assumptions, the collapse of confidence, and the birth of a psychological phenomenon that would plague Allied leadership throughout the North African campaign. What happened in those crucial hours outside the fortress walls? Why did experienced British generals, who had defeated numerically superior Italian armies, find themselves outmaneuvered by a force that had barely arrived in Africa? And perhaps most troubling, how did one man's audacity create a trap that existed as much in the minds of Allied commanders as it did in the physical terrain of Libya's western desert? This is the story of how Rommel's actions at Mechili transformed him from a newly arrived German general into a phantom that haunted Allied strategic planning. It is the tale of how psychological warfare, tactical brilliance, and calculated risk-taking converged to create a defeat so stunning that it paralyzed decision-making at the highest levels of British command for years to come. February 1941 marked a moment of cautious optimism for British forces in North Africa. Operation Compass, launched in December 1940, had achieved results beyond the most optimistic projections. General Richard O'Connor's Western Desert Force had advanced hundreds of miles, destroyed 10 Italian divisions, captured 130,000 prisoners, and taken 400 tanks and 1,290 artillery pieces, all while suffering fewer than 2,000 casualties. The victories at Beit Affom and Benghazi seemed to herald the complete collapse of Italian military power in Libya. Mechili itself stood as a symbol of this newfound dominance. Located approximately 120 miles south of Benghazi and 100 miles inland from the coastal road that served as North Africa's primary artery, the fortress occupied strategic high ground in a region defined by rocky escarpments and vast emptiness. British planners viewed it as a strongpoint that could anchor the southern flank of any defensive line, a place where supplies could be concentrated and from which mobile columns could intercept enemy movements through the desert's interior. The garrison assembled at Mechili reflected British confidence. Major General Michael Gambier Parry commanded the 2nd Armoured Division, though many of its most experienced units had been withdrawn for service in Greece. What remained included elements of the 3rd Armoured Brigade, the support group of the division, and Indian troops, a force that British planners deemed more than adequate for defending against the shattered remnants of the Italian army and providing a mobile reserve for the region. Yet 3,000 miles away in Berlin, Adolf Hitler had already made a decision that would transform North Africa from a secondary theater into a proving ground for one of Germany's most dynamic commanders. Erwin Rommel, the general who had led the 7th Panzer Division through France with such aggressive speed that it earned the nickname Ghost Division, received orders to deploy to Libya with a modest force. 2 divisions, designated as the Deutsches Afrika Korps, tasked with preventing the complete collapse of Germany's Italian allies. Rommel arrived in Tripoli on February 12, 1941, and immediately began studying the desert that would become his battlefield. What he discovered troubled him. Italian morale was shattered, defensive positions were poorly chosen, and British forces were advancing with what appeared to be unstoppable momentum. However, Rommel also recognized something his superiors in Berlin had not fully appreciated. The British army that had achieved such stunning victories was now stretched thin, its most experienced units being withdrawn for operations elsewhere, its supply lines extended to the breaking point. The conventional response would have been to establish a defensive line, wait for reinforcements, and avoid engagement with an enemy that had demonstrated overwhelming superiority against Axis forces. Rommel's actual response revealed the quality that would define his entire North African campaign. He attacked. On March 24, 1941, German forces struck at El Agheila, driving back British covering forces and seizing the initiative. What followed was not a methodical advance, but an eruption of movement that seemed to defy military logic. Multiple columns racing across the desert, appearing at unexpected locations, creating the impression of forces far larger than actually existed. British commanders, accustomed to the predictable movements of Italian forces, found themselves struggling to track an enemy that refused to behave according to established patterns. Intelligence reports became exercises in confusion. Was Rommel advancing with 2 divisions or 10? Were these reconnaissance units or the vanguard of a major offensive? The fog of war, always present in military operations, became an impenetrable murk through which German columns moved like phantoms. This was the context in which Mechili's fate was sealed. As March turned to April, British commanders faced a crisis of understanding. Their intelligence apparatus, built to monitor and predict the behavior of Italian forces, proved inadequate for tracking an enemy who seemed to operate by different rules entirely. Communication between forward units and headquarters became sporadic. Supply lines that had seemed adequate now revealed their fragility. And at the center of this maelstrom, Rommel drove his forces forward with a speed that left his own staff officers questioning his sanity. The garrison at Mechili represented more than just troops and supplies. It embodied British assumptions about desert warfare, about the pace of operations, about the time commanders would have to assess threats and respond accordingly. Rommel was about to demonstrate how catastrophically wrong those assumptions were, and in doing so, create a psychological wound that would fester throughout the entire North African campaign. The strategic importance of Mechili extended beyond its immediate military value. The fortress controlled access routes through the Jebel Akhdar, the mountainous region that offered one of the few sources of water and cultivation in this arid landscape. Whoever held Mechili could threaten enemy supply lines running along the coast while maintaining their own logistics through the desert interior. British planners had recognized this when they fortified the position after capturing it from Italian forces. Now those same fortifications would be tested against an opponent far more capable than the demoralized Italians who had surrendered them. The composition of forces at Mechili revealed the challenges facing British commanders throughout the theater. The 2nd Armored Division, while nominally a powerful formation, had been gutted by transfers to Greece. Many of its tanks were worn out from the previous campaign against the Italians, and replacement parts were scarce. The crews, while experienced, were exhausted from months of continuous operations. The supporting Indian infantry units, though reliable and well-trained, lacked the mobility to respond quickly to threats in the vast desert spaces surrounding the fortress. Meanwhile, Rommel's Africa Corps, though smaller than British intelligence estimated, possessed qualitative advantages that multiplied its effectiveness. German tanks, particularly the Panzer III and Afafthor models, featured superior optics and radio communication that allowed coordinated maneuvers British formations struggled to match. German doctrine emphasized combined arms operations, integrating tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support in ways that maximized the effectiveness of each element. Perhaps most importantly, German forces possessed leadership that encouraged initiative and rapid decision-making at all levels, a stark contrast to the more rigid British command structure. Understanding what happened at Mechili requires understanding the man who orchestrated it. Erwin Johannes Eugen Rommel was born on November 15, 1891, in Heidenheim, a small town in southern Germany, far from the Prussian military tradition that dominated the German officer corps. His father was a schoolteacher, his mother the daughter of a senior civil servant, middle-class origins that would mark Rommel as an outsider among the aristocratic officers who controlled the German military establishment. Young Rommel displayed no early brilliance that suggested future military genius. His initial inclination toward engineering gave way to a military career almost by chance, following his father's suggestion. Joining the 124th Württemberg Infantry Regiment in 1910 as an officer cadet, Rommel proved himself a competent but unremarkable junior officer. What distinguished him was not intellectual brilliance. He never attended the prestigious German War Academy, but rather a practical, hands-on approach to military problems and an instinct for the decisive moment in combat. World War I transformed Rommel from a conventional officer into something different. Serving in France, Romania, and Italy, he demonstrated an aggressive approach to combat that earned him both the Pour le Mérite, Imperial Germany's highest military decoration, and a reputation for taking risks that horrified more conservative commanders. At Caporetto in October 1917, Then Captain Rommel led his mountain troops in a series of bold infiltrations that resulted in the capture of 9,000 Italian soldiers and 81 artillery pieces, achievements that foreshadowed his later methods in North Africa. The interwar years proved frustrating for Rommel. Germany's defeat left him in a shrunken army with limited prospects for advancement. Unlike many of his peers, he did not immerse himself in theoretical studies of modern warfare. Instead, he taught infantry tactics at Dresden and wrote Infantry Attacks, a practical manual drawn from his World War I experiences that emphasized speed, surprise, and the importance of leading from the front. The book brought him modest fame within military circles and, more importantly, caught the attention of Adolf Hitler, who appreciated Rommel's emphasis on aggressive action and his non-aristocratic background. When World War II erupted, Rommel commanded Hitler's bodyguard during the Polish campaign before receiving command of the 7th Panzer Division for the invasion of France. Here, Rommel's approach to warfare crystallized into the method that would define his career. He pushed his division forward with relentless speed, often positioning himself at the very front of his advancing columns, navigating by compass when maps proved inadequate, maintaining momentum even when supply lines frayed and flanks remained exposed. The 7th Panzer Division advanced so rapidly and appeared so unexpectedly at so many locations that both enemies and allies struggled to track its movements, hence the nickname Ghost Division. This experience taught Rommel several lessons that he would apply devastatingly in North Africa. First, speed itself was a weapon that could paralyze enemy decision-making. Second, appearing where the enemy least expected created psychological effects that multiplied physical strength. Third, commanders who positioned themselves at the front could make decisions based on immediate battlefield reality rather than delayed and often inaccurate reports. Fourth, taking calculated risks often proved less dangerous than methodical caution because momentum and surprise compensated for numerical inferiority. Yet France also revealed limitations that would haunt Rommel in Africa. His aggressive advance sometimes left his division isolated and vulnerable. His tendency to push ahead without ensuring adequate supplies created logistical crises. His practice of commanding from the front meant that higher headquarters sometimes lost contact with him at crucial moments. More conservative German generals viewed Rommel's methods with suspicion, seeing recklessness where he saw opportunity. When Rommel received orders to deploy to North Africa, he entered a theater that seemed ideally suited to his methods. The desert offered vast spaces for maneuver, long exposed flanks that rewarded bold movements, and an enemy that would struggle to adapt to his unconventional approach. But the desert also amplified the weaknesses in his method. Supply lines stretched even thinner, communication became even more difficult, and the unforgiving environment punished mistakes with swift brutality. Rommel arrived in Tripoli on February 12, 1941, with advance elements of the 5th Light Division, later to be joined by the 15th Panzer Division. His orders from the German High Command were clear: establish a defensive line, prevent the complete collapse of Italian forces, and avoid major operations until both divisions were fully deployed and acclimatized. These were sensible orders from a strategic perspective. The German military's main focus remained the planned invasion of the Soviet Union. North Africa was a sideshow, useful only insofar as it kept Italian morale from collapsing entirely. Rommel surveyed the situation and promptly ignored his orders. What he saw convinced him that the appearance of British strength masked actual vulnerability. Yes, British forces had achieved stunning victories against the Italians, but Rommel recognized that those victories had been won largely against an enemy suffering from poor morale, inadequate equipment, and incompetent leadership. More importantly, he observed that British forces were now dispersed, their best units being withdrawn for Greece, their remaining forces spread across hundreds of miles of territory that required defense. On March 24th, Rommel attacked at El Agheila with forces that should have been insufficient for offensive operations. The German advance caught British commanders off guard, not because they thought it impossible, but because it seemed irrational, the antithesis of the methodical German military tradition. What British intelligence failed to recognize was that Rommel operated by his own logic, one forged in the mountains of Italy during World War I and refined on the roads of France in 1940. The advance from El Agheila to Mechili covered hundreds of miles of some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. Rommel divided his forces into multiple columns, each following different routes through the desert, coordinating their movements to create the impression of an overwhelming force advancing on multiple axes. He personally moved between columns in his command vehicle, often positioning himself at the head of advancing units, navigating by compass when tracks disappeared into featureless sand and rock. British commanders, receiving reports of German columns appearing at widely separated locations, struggled to compile an accurate picture of enemy strength and intentions. Was this a reconnaissance in force or a major offensive? Were these separate units or the same formation appearing at different locations? The intelligence officer's nightmare, too much contradictory information, paralyzed British decision-making at the crucial moment. By early April, Rommel's columns were converging on Mechili from multiple directions. What the garrison's defenders did not fully understand was that they faced not just a military assault, but a commander who had spent 25 years refining an approach to warfare that prioritized psychological impact as much as physical destruction. The trap was not merely geographical, it existed in the assumptions and expectations of British commanders who still thought they understood the rules of desert warfare. The personal characteristics that defined Rommel's command style had been forged over decades of military service. Unlike many general officers who commanded from comfortable headquarters far behind the lines, Rommel insisted on seeing the battlefield with his own eyes. This habit, developed during World War I when he had led small units in desperate infantry assaults, persisted even when he commanded divisions and corps. He traveled in a command vehicle equipped with radios and maps, but his most important tool was his own observation. He would appear suddenly at critical points in a battle, assess the situation personally, and issue orders based on what he could see, rather than what staff officers reported. This approach had obvious advantages. Rommel could respond to opportunities or threats with immediacy, impossible for commanders who relied on reports filtered through multiple layers of staff officers. He developed an intuitive understanding of terrain, enemy dispositions, and the morale of his own troops that no amount of map study could replicate. His sudden appearances at critical moments inspired German soldiers, who came to believe their commander possessed an almost supernatural awareness of battlefield conditions. But the approach also had significant disadvantages that would become increasingly apparent as the North African campaign progressed. When Rommel positioned himself at the front, higher headquarters often lost contact with him at crucial moments. Staff officers, uncertain of their commander's location and unable to reach him for decisions, sometimes hesitated when rapid action was required. The command structure, dependent on Rommel's personal presence and decision-making, struggled to function effectively when he was unavailable. Moreover, Rommel's focus on tactical details sometimes came at the expense of attention to strategic and logistical matters that determined whether tactical victories could be sustained. The journey from El Agheila to Mechili in late March and early April 1941 exemplified both the strengths and weaknesses of Rommel's approach. His decision to divide his forces into multiple columns, each advancing along different axes, created confusion that paralyzed British response. His personal leadership of advance elements ensured that opportunities were exploited immediately. His willingness to push forward despite uncertain supply lines and exposed flanks seized initiative from an enemy still trying to understand what was happening. Yet the same advance stretched German logistics to the breaking point. Tanks broke down from the strain of rapid movement across brutal terrain. Fuel supplies ran dangerously low. Communication between dispersed columns became sporadic. Rommel's staff officers, watching supply indicators decline while their commander pushed forward, wondered whether audacity had crossed into recklessness. The answer would depend on whether the psychological impact of rapid advance created opportunities that compensated for material vulnerabilities. The story of Mechili illuminates fundamental concepts about the nature of warfare that extend far beyond a single battle in the Libyan desert. At its heart lies a question that has vexed military thinkers for millennia. How does a commander overcome material inferiority? Rommel's answer involved the weaponization of perception itself, the transformation of uncertainty into a paralyzing force more effective than bullets or shells. Traditional military thinking emphasizes the concentration of force at the decisive point. Rommel understood this principle, but applied it in an unexpected way. Rather than concentrating his actually quite modest forces physically, he concentrated their psychological impact. By dividing his forces into multiple columns that appeared at unexpected locations, he created the perception of overwhelming strength. British intelligence officers, struggling to reconcile contradictory reports, consistently overestimated German forces, sometimes by factors of 3 or 4. This perception of strength had real battlefield effects, causing British commanders to make decisions based not on actual German capabilities, but on imagined ones. The concept of tempo, the speed at which military operations unfold, takes on particular importance in understanding Mechili. Rommel recognized that modern communication technology, while improving coordination, also created vulnerabilities. Decisions made at headquarters based on day-old intelligence could be catastrophically wrong if the battlefield situation had changed dramatically in the interim. By operating at a tempo faster than British decision-making cycles, Rommel ensured that Allied commanders were constantly reacting to situations that had already evolved beyond the information they possessed. Consider the challenge facing British commanders in early April 1941. Reports arrived indicating German forces at multiple locations. Each report required evaluation. Was it accurate? How large was the enemy force? What was its objective? This information then traveled up the command hierarchy, where staff officers compiled it into situation reports. These reports informed decisions about troop movements, which then had to be transmitted back down to frontline units and executed. This cycle, observation, transmission, analysis, decision, transmission, execution, consumed precious time, and each step introduced potential delays and distortions. Rommel compressed this cycle by commanding from the front. When he identified an opportunity, he could order its exploitation immediately, without waiting for information to travel up and down a hierarchy. This created a situation where German forces were consistently inside the decision-making loop of their opponents, acting while British commanders were still processing information about German positions from hours or days earlier. The concept of mission-type tactics, deeply embedded in German military culture, played a crucial role. Rather than issuing detailed orders specifying every action, German commanders communicated intent and objectives, leaving subordinate officers free to adapt their methods to changing circumstances. This approach distributed decision-making authority downward, allowing rapid responses to emerging opportunities without waiting for approval from higher headquarters. British military culture, with its more centralized command structure and emphasis on following detailed orders, proved less adaptable to the fluid conditions of desert warfare. Yet Rommel's approach also embodied a paradox that would eventually contribute to Axis defeats in North Africa. His emphasis on speed and momentum often came at the expense of logistical sustainability. The same aggressive advances that paralyzed Allied decision-making also stretched German supply lines beyond their breaking point. Tanks broke down faster than they could be repaired. Fuel and ammunition ran short at critical moments. The very characteristics that made Rommel's forces so dangerous in offensive operations, their speed and unpredictability, made them vulnerable when forced onto the defensive. This paradox reveals a deeper truth about the nature of military innovation. Rommel's methods worked brilliantly against an opponent still adapting to his approach, but military innovations rarely remain effective indefinitely. Opponents study, adapt, and develop countermeasures. What appears revolutionary in 1941 becomes predictable by 1942 and obsolete by 1943. Rommel's tragedy was that his methods never evolved as quickly as Allied capacity to understand and counter them. The psychological dimension of Rommel's approach deserves particular attention. Military theorist John Boyd later developed the concept of the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, to describe the cycle of decision-making in combat. Boyd argued that victory goes to the side that can cycle through this loop faster than their opponent, because rapid cycling creates situations where the enemy is constantly reacting to outdated information. Rommel, though he never formulated the theory explicitly, instinctively understood this principle. By operating at tempo faster than Allied observation and decision cycles, he forced British commanders into a perpetual state of reaction, always responding to situations that had already changed. But there was another psychological dimension to Rommel's approach, the creation of what military theorists call command presence, or what might more colloquially be termed reputation. Rommel cultivated an image of invincibility, both among his own troops and among enemy forces. His habit of commanding from the front, often appearing at unexpected moments to rally wavering units or exploit sudden opportunities, created stories that spread through both armies. To German soldiers, he became the commander who was everywhere, who understood the battlefield intuitively, who would appear precisely when and where he was most needed. To Allied soldiers, he became an almost mythical figure, the desert fox whose cunning could transform defeat into victory, whose presence on the battlefield meant danger regardless of the odds. This reputation had tangible battlefield effects. German troops fought with enhanced confidence, believing their commander possessed near supernatural awareness of battlefield conditions. Allied troops fought with diminished confidence, suspecting that even apparently favorable situations might be traps sprung by Rommel's tactical genius. Commanders on both sides made decisions influenced by this reputation, German officers taking risks they might otherwise have avoided, Allied officers exercising caution that sometimes prevented them from exploiting genuine opportunities. The importance of terrain takes on particular significance in desert warfare, but not in the way that terrain matters in conventional military operations. In forests or mountains or urban areas, terrain provides cover and concealment, channels movement along predictable routes, and creates natural strongpoints. The desert offers none of these advantages. Instead, desert terrain creates navigational challenges, logistical nightmares, and vast open spaces where forces can maneuver with few geographical constraints, but equally few sources of water, fuel, or supplies. Rommel grasped that desert warfare rewarded mobility and punished static defense. The traditional military emphasis on holding ground became less relevant when ground itself offered few inherent advantages. What mattered was the capacity to concentrate forces rapidly at decisive points, then disperse before enemy artillery or air power could inflict crippling damage. This required a mental flexibility that Allied commanders, trained in European warfare, where terrain features dominated tactical thinking, struggled to develop. The role of intelligence and counterintelligence emerged as critical to desert operations. In environments where vast distances and difficult terrain made direct observation of enemy forces challenging, commanders relied heavily on intelligence to inform decisions. This created opportunities for deception that Rommel exploited ruthlessly. By controlling what British intelligence observed, through dummy tanks, dispersed columns that created impressions of larger forces, and rapid movements that made tracking difficult, Rommel transformed British intelligence from an asset into a liability that fed misleading information into Allied decision-making. The interplay between intelligence and deception at Mechili demonstrated these principles with brutal clarity. British intelligence, attempting to track German movements, received reports of enemy columns at locations separated by dozens of miles. The natural assumption was that these represented different formations, suggesting German forces far larger than actually existed. In reality, many reports described the same units observed at different times and locations as they moved rapidly across the desert. But reconciling these reports into an accurate picture required time that British decision-making cycles could not afford. Rommel compounded this confusion through deliberate deception. German columns traveled with extra vehicles, creating dust clouds that suggested larger formations. Captured British vehicles, pressed into service by German forces, created uncertainty about whether observed units were friendly or enemy. Radio discipline, strictly enforced among German units, prevented British signals intelligence from accurately tracking force dispositions. The result was an intelligence picture so confused that British commanders, lacking confidence in their understanding of enemy strength and positions, defaulted to worst-case assumptions that overestimated German capabilities. This intelligence failure had cascading effects on British decision-making. Commanders uncertain about enemy strength hesitated to commit forces that might be needed elsewhere. Plans for relief columns or counterattacks were delayed pending clearer intelligence that never arrived. Defensive positions, selected based on assumptions about German capabilities that proved wildly inaccurate, failed to account for actual threats. By the time accurate intelligence emerged, the situation had already changed, rendering the information obsolete before it could inform effective responses. The broader context of desert warfare also shaped events at Mechili in ways that merit examination. North Africa represented a unique military environment where traditional European military doctrine often proved inadequate. The vast distances, extreme climate, and scarcity of water and supplies created challenges that commanders trained in European warfare struggled to address. Armies that could sustain themselves through local requisition in Europe found themselves entirely dependent on supply lines stretching hundreds of miles through hostile desert. This logistical reality meant that desert warfare often resembled naval warfare more than land warfare. Like fleets at sea, armies in the desert moved across featureless expanses, their ability to sustain operations determined by the efficiency of supply lines rather than by captured territory. Battles were won not by seizing key terrain features, but by destroying enemy forces or cutting their supply lines. The fortress at Mechili, seemingly strong because of its fortifications, was actually vulnerable because its garrison depended entirely on supplies brought from distant bases. Rommel understood these realities intuitively. His experience in France had taught him that mobility and speed could compensate for numerical inferiority. The desert magnified these lessons. A force that could move rapidly, appearing where least expected, could achieve effects disproportionate to its size. But the same environment that rewarded mobility also punished logistical failure with merciless speed. Armies that outran their supplies found themselves stranded, vulnerable to counterattack, unable to exploit tactical victories. This tension between operational opportunity and logistical reality would characterize Rommel's entire North African campaign. The actual operation against Mechili demonstrated how Rommel's theoretical approach translated into battlefield practice with devastating effectiveness. By April 6, 1941, German columns were converging on the fortress from multiple directions, having advanced hundreds of miles through desert that British commanders considered impassable for large formations. The garrison at Mechili found itself confronting a nightmare scenario, surrounded by forces of unknown strength, cut off from reinforcement, facing an enemy commander whose reputation already exceeded his actual capabilities. Rommel's solution to the problem of capturing a fortified position with limited forces involved several interlocking elements. First, he ensured that the garrison had minimal accurate information about his actual strength. German columns approached from multiple directions, creating the impression of overwhelming force. Reconnaissance units probed defenses, appearing and disappearing before defenders could accurately count their numbers. Captured vehicles were pressed into service, adding to the confusion about whether attacking forces were German, Italian, or some combination thereof. Second, Rommel compressed the timeline for British decision-making to the point where rational responses became impossible. The speed of the German advance meant that by the time British commanders recognized the threat to Mechili, options for reinforcement or withdrawal had already narrowed dramatically. Orders to withdraw reached the garrison after German forces had already cut primary escape routes. Attempts to organize relief columns found that the fluid battlefield situation had changed so rapidly that intelligence about German positions was obsolete before relief forces could respond. Third, Rommel exploited the psychological impact of encirclement. Military forces can sustain tremendous casualties when they believe victory remains possible or retreat remains available. But encirclement creates a unique psychological pressure. Defenders recognize that each passing hour reduces their ammunition, water, and food, while increasing the likelihood that eventual surrender or destruction is inevitable. This knowledge corrodes morale in ways that direct combat sometimes does not. The actual assault on Mechili began on April 6th, with probing attacks designed to identify defensive weak points and maintain pressure on the garrison. German artillery, though limited in number, maintained harassing fire that prevented rest and created the impression of larger forces preparing for assault. Rommel personally reconnoitered defensive positions, a practice that exposed him to enemy fire, but provided him with information more current and accurate than any written report could offer. On April 7th, Rommel issued an ultimatum to the garrison: surrender or face complete destruction. This was psychological warfare of the highest order. The ultimatum implied that German forces possessed both the capacity and willingness to annihilate the garrison if resistance continued, an implication that far exceeded actual German capabilities. But Major General Gambier Parry, the garrison commander, lacked accurate information about German strength and had received contradictory orders from higher headquarters. Should he attempt a breakout, wait for relief, surrender to avoid unnecessary casualties? The surrender of Mechili on April 8, 1941, delivered into German hands approximately 2,700 prisoners, including Gambier Parry and other senior officers, along with significant quantities of vehicles, fuel, and supplies. But the material gains, significant as they were, paled in comparison to the psychological impact. British commanders had witnessed a supposedly impregnable position fall in less than 2 days to a force that, by conventional military logic, should never have reached it. Rommel's solution to the problem of operational success with limited resources involved accepting risks that would have horrified more conservative commanders. His columns advanced with exposed flanks, trusting that speed and surprise would compensate for vulnerabilities. He committed forces to attacks without maintaining adequate reserves, gambling that initial success would create opportunities for exploitation. He pushed logistical systems beyond their sustainable limits, assuming that captured British supplies would compensate for gaps in German logistics. These gambles succeeded at Mechili, and that success reinforced both Rommel's confidence in his methods and Allied commanders' perception that they faced an opponent capable of achieving impossible victories. But the very audacity that made these gambles successful also contained the seeds of future failures. Supply lines stretched too thin would eventually snap. Forces committed without reserves would eventually face counterattacks they could not repel. The operational brilliance that achieved tactical victories would eventually collide with strategic realities that no amount of tactical genius could overcome. The immediate Allied response to Mechili revealed the depth of psychological impact. British commanders, who had defeated Italian forces with casual efficiency, now viewed German forces through a lens of exaggerated respect bordering on fear. Intelligence estimates of German strength grew wildly inflated. Plans for counterattacks were postponed pending reinforcement, then postponed again when additional reinforcements seemed inadequate. The initiative that British forces had seized in Operation Compass now passed entirely to Rommel, who exploited it with characteristic aggression. Field Marshal Archibald Wavell, commanding British forces in the Middle East, found himself forced to divide attention and resources between multiple crisis points. The withdrawal of forces for operations in Greece had already weakened his position in North Africa. Now Rommel's offensive threatened to reverse all the gains of Operation Compass. Worse, the unpredictability of German movements made defensive planning nearly impossible. Where would Rommel strike next? What were his objectives? Did he have the logistical capacity to advance further, or would he outrun his supplies as conventional military logic suggested he must? These questions paralyzed British decision-making in ways that mere battlefield defeats could not have achieved. A commander who loses a battle knows what happened and can adjust plans accordingly. But a commander who cannot reliably predict where the enemy will appear next, who cannot accurately estimate enemy strength, and who has watched supposedly secure positions fall with shocking speed, faces a more fundamental crisis of understanding. This was Rommel's true achievement at Mechili, not merely the capture of a fortress, but the shattering of Allied commanders' confidence in their ability to understand and predict battlefield events. The tactical methods Rommel employed at Mechili would become his signature throughout the North African campaign. The approach from multiple directions created confusion and prevented defenders from concentrating forces against a single threat. The rapid pace of operations compressed enemy decision-making cycles, forcing responses based on incomplete or outdated information. The careful management of what defenders could observe, revealing just enough to create fear while concealing actual vulnerabilities, transformed intelligence from an asset into a source of paralyzing uncertainty. Yet these same methods carried inherent limitations that became more apparent over time. The approach from multiple directions required dividing forces, creating temporary vulnerabilities that skilled opponents could exploit. The rapid pace that compressed enemy decision-making also strained logistics and exhausted troops. The deception that created psychological advantage required significant effort to maintain and became less effective as opponents grew familiar with the methods. The siege of Tobruk, which followed shortly after Mechili, demonstrated both the continued effectiveness of Rommel's methods and their emerging limitations. Rommel surrounded the fortress and demanded surrender, expecting a repetition of Mechili's quick collapse, but the Australian garrison at Tobruk, commanded by officers who understood that much of Rommel's strength was psychological, refused to be intimidated. They held the fortress through months of siege, tying down German forces and preventing Rommel from exploiting his victory at Mechili with a rapid advance to the Suez Canal. This contrast between Mechili and Tobruk illuminates an important truth about psychological warfare. It works best against opponents who lack confidence or accurate understanding of their situation. The garrison at Mechili, confused about German strength and uncertain of support, succumbed quickly to psychological pressure. The garrison at Tobruk, confident in their defenses and determined to resist, proved immune to the same psychological tactics. This suggested that Rommel's methods, while brilliant, were not universally applicable. Their effectiveness depended on conditions that skillful opponents could potentially negate. The capture of Mechili also provided Rommel with tangible benefits beyond psychological impact. The captured vehicles, fuel and supplies significantly improved German logistical position at a critical moment. British vehicles, particularly the reliable and numerous trucks captured at Mechili, became essential components of German logistics in subsequent operations. Fuel stocks, desperately needed for continued offensive operations, allowed German columns to maintain momentum. Artillery pieces and ammunition augmented German fire support capabilities. These material gains demonstrated another dimension of Rommel's operational approach. His offensives were designed not just to defeat enemy forces, but to capture supplies that would enable continued operations. This living off the land, or more accurately, living off the enemy approach, allowed German forces to sustain offensives despite inadequate supply lines from Tripoli. But it also created a dangerous dependency. German operations required continued success to generate the captured supplies needed for continued operations. Any significant setback that failed to yield captured supplies could trigger a logistical crisis that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. The broader operational situation in April 1941 reveals how Mechili fit into Rommel's overall campaign strategy. The fortress was not his ultimate objective, but rather an obstacle that blocked his advance toward more strategic targets. By eliminating the garrison at Mechili quickly, Rommel freed forces for exploitation toward the Egyptian border, while eliminating a threat to his southern flank and supply lines. The speed of victory allowed him to maintain operational momentum, keeping British forces off balance and unable to establish stable defensive lines. This operational-level thinking, viewing individual battles not as ends in themselves but as components of larger campaigns, distinguished Rommel from more tactically focused commanders. He understood that victory at Mechili mattered less for the fortress itself than for what it enabled. Continued offensive operations that prevented British forces from recovering balance and establishing effective defenses. Each tactical success created opportunities for further advances that compounded British difficulties, turning a series of local defeats into a strategic crisis that threatened the entire British position in North Africa. The mythology that grew around Rommel and Mechili requires critical examination, both for historical accuracy and for understanding the actual dynamics of the North African campaign. While Rommel's tactical brilliance was undeniable, the narrative of the invincible Desert Fox, outmaneuvering superior Allied forces, oversimplifies a more complex reality where German advantages in training, equipment, and doctrine played roles at least as important as Rommel's personal genius. German forces arriving in North Africa possessed several critical advantages that Allied accounts often minimized. German tanks, particularly the Panzer III and Panzer IV, featured superior optics that allowed German tank crews to identify and engage targets at greater ranges than their British counterparts. German anti-tank guns, especially the fearsome 80 mm flak gun employed in ground rolls, could destroy any British tank from ranges where British guns could not effectively respond. German combined arms doctrine, which integrated tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support into coordinated operations, had been refined through campaigns in Poland and France and proved far more sophisticated than British doctrine that often employed tanks independent of adequate infantry or artillery support. The training standards of German forces also exceeded those of many British units in North Africa. German tank crews underwent extensive training before deployment, learning not just vehicle operation, but tactics for employment in coordinated formations. German infantry had experienced combat in Europe and understood the importance of combined arms cooperation. German officers, schooled in a tradition that emphasized initiative and mission-type tactics, made decisions at the tactical level with a sophistication that Allied officers, often constrained by more rigid command structures, struggled to match. These advantages mean that even without Rommel, German forces would likely have achieved significant success against the forces Britain could deploy in early 1941. The withdrawal of experienced British units for Greece, the dispersion of remaining forces across vast distances, and the inadequacy of British equipment created vulnerabilities that competent German commanders would have exploited. Rommel's genius lay not in creating these vulnerabilities, but in recognizing and exploiting them with exceptional speed and aggression. Yet the Allied perspective on Mechili and Rommel's subsequent operations also reveals important truths about the psychological dimension of warfare. Whether Rommel's reputation was entirely deserved matters less than the fact that Allied commanders believed it was deserved. This belief influenced decisions at every level. British tanks withdrew from positions they might have held because commanders feared being trapped by Rommel's tactical ingenuity. British generals postponed offensives pending additional reinforcements because they overestimated German strength and capabilities. British soldiers fought with the psychological burden of facing an opponent whose very name suggested invincibility. This psychological impact represents perhaps Rommel's most significant achievement and most troubling legacy. By creating an aura of invincibility, he multiplied the effectiveness of forces that were actually quite limited. But this same aura also created problems for clear-eyed assessment of German capabilities and vulnerabilities. Allied intelligence, instead of soberly analyzing German strengths and weaknesses, often simply assumed that Rommel possessed near supernatural tactical abilities. This assumption prevented the kind of dispassionate analysis that might have identified exploitable German weaknesses earlier in the campaign. The comparison with other commanders illuminates both Rommel's unique qualities and his limitations. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who would eventually defeat Rommel at El Alamein, represented an almost diametrically opposite command philosophy. Where Rommel emphasized speed, surprise, and personal leadership from the front, Montgomery emphasized methodical preparation, overwhelming material superiority, and careful coordination of all arms. Where Rommel gambled on operational brilliance overcoming logistical constraints, Montgomery refused to attack until he had assembled force ratios that virtually guaranteed success. History has tended to romanticize Rommel's approach, while viewing Montgomery's as prosaic and uninspired. Yet Montgomery won the decisive battles of the North African campaign, not through tactical brilliance, but through the recognition that modern industrial warfare ultimately favored the side that could bring superior resources to bear at the decisive point. Rommel's tactical victories, brilliant as they were, could not overcome the fundamental reality that Germany could not supply forces in North Africa adequately while simultaneously conducting operations in the Soviet Union and defending against Allied strategic bombing. The strategic context of Mechili also deserves examination. From Germany's perspective, North Africa was always a secondary theater, a sideshow undertaken primarily to prevent Italian collapse. Hitler never committed to North Africa the resources that might have enabled decisive victory. Rommel received 2 divisions when he needed 10, inadequate logistics when he needed robust supply lines, and inconsistent air support when he needed air superiority. His tactical brilliance enabled him to achieve far more than strategic circumstances should have allowed, but it could not substitute for the fundamental resource commitment that Axis victory would have required. From Britain's perspective, North Africa was also a secondary theatre, but one where they could engage Axis forces while building strength for eventual operations in Europe. The decision to withdraw forces for Greece, while militarily disastrous in the short term, reflected strategic calculations about maintaining alliance relationships and preventing German domination of the Balkans. These broader strategic concerns meant that commanders in North Africa often operated with inadequate resources, not because of incompetence, but because strategic priorities dictated resource allocation elsewhere. The moral and ethical dimensions of Rommel's legacy remain subjects of intense debate. Post-war mythology transformed him into the good German, a professional soldier who fought honorably, who did not participate in Nazi atrocities, who even allegedly considered joining the plot against Hitler. This narrative, promoted partly by former German officers seeking to rehabilitate the Wehrmacht's reputation and partly by Allied commanders seeking to explain their defeats, requires critical examination. Rommel was unquestionably complicit in the Nazi regime. He benefited from Hitler's patronage, accepted promotions and honors from the Nazi state, and commanded forces fighting to achieve Nazi objectives. While evidence suggests he did not personally participate in war crimes, The Africa Corps operated in an environment where the German military routinely committed atrocities. The romantic image of clean desert warfare, untainted by the horrors that characterized the Eastern Front, obscures uncomfortable realities about occupation, treatment of prisoners, and the broader context of the war Rommel fought. Yet acknowledging Rommel's complicity with Nazism need not prevent recognizing his military abilities or understanding why Allied commanders feared him. The two assessments can coexist. Rommel was both a brilliant tactical commander whose innovations in mobile warfare influenced military thinking for decades, and a willing participant in a regime of unspeakable evil. History's task is not to choose between these assessments, but to hold both in tension, recognizing complexity rather than seeking simplistic heroes or villains. The ultimate question Mechili poses is whether tactical brilliance can overcome strategic reality. Rommel's campaigns in North Africa suggest a troubling answer. Tactical brilliance can achieve remarkable victories, can defeat opponents with superior resources, can create legends that persist decades after the battles themselves. But tactical brilliance cannot substitute for adequate resources, sustainable logistics, or sound strategic planning. Rommel won battles throughout 1941 and 1942, but Germany lost the North African campaign. His tactical victories, while genuine achievements, ultimately meant little in the face of strategic failure. This tension between tactical success and strategic failure offers lessons that extend far beyond World War II. Modern military forces must balance the cultivation of tactical excellence with attention to the logistical, strategic, and political contexts in which military force operates. Commanders who achieve tactical brilliance while ignoring strategic realities may win battles while losing wars. The worship of tactical genius, divorced from consideration of broader contexts, can lead military organizations to cultivate skills that prove irrelevant to actual strategic challenges. The analysis of Mechili also reveals the danger of allowing psychological factors to override objective assessment. Allied commanders, traumatized by the speed and surprise of Rommel's victories, developed an exaggerated respect that influenced decisions long after the initial shock should have worn off. This psychological impact, while understandable given the circumstances, prevented the kind of clear-eyed analysis that might have revealed German vulnerabilities sooner. Military organizations must cultivate the capacity to learn from defeats without being paralyzed by them, to respect enemy capabilities without exaggerating them, to maintain analytical rigor even in the face of shocking setbacks. The technological and doctrinal factors that contributed to German success at Mechili merit reflection as well. Superior optics, better radio communication, more effective anti-tank weapons, these material advantages multiplied the impact of tactical skill. Combined arms doctrine that integrated different combat systems into coordinated wholes proved more effective than approaches that employed forces piecemeal. Mission-type tactics that empowered subordinate commanders to exercise initiative within broadly defined objectives proved more adaptable than rigid command structures that required approval for every significant decision. These lessons about the importance of material quality, doctrine, and command culture remain relevant to contemporary military forces. Technological superiority matters, but only if employed within doctrines that exploit it effectively. Command cultures that encourage initiative and adaptability produce better results than those that emphasize rigid compliance with detailed orders. Training that produces not just technical proficiency, but tactical understanding enables forces to respond effectively to unexpected situations. Yet Mechili also demonstrates the limits of material and doctrinal advantages. German forces, despite their qualitative superiority, could not overcome the fundamental reality of strategic overextension. As the North African campaign progressed, Allied forces learned to counter German tactics, developed equipment that narrowed capability gaps, and accumulated material superiority that eventually became overwhelming. By 1942, the advantages German forces enjoyed in 1941 had diminished significantly, and by 1943, Allied forces possessed clear superiority in almost every dimension of military capability. This progression illustrates that tactical innovations and material advantages rarely provide permanent superiority. Opponents study, adapt, and develop countermeasures. What works brilliantly in one campaign becomes less effective as enemies learn from experience. Military success requires not just initial advantages, but the capacity to innovate continuously, adapting faster than opponents can counter. Rommel's methods, revolutionary in 1941, became increasingly predictable as Allied commanders gained experience fighting against them and developed responses that neutralized their effectiveness. The human dimension of Mechili deserves consideration as well. The soldiers who fought and died there, who surrendered after being convinced their situation was hopeless, who experienced the terror of encirclement and the despair of abandonment. These individuals endured experiences that transcended the strategic and tactical considerations that occupy military historians. For them, Mechili was not a case study in mobile warfare or psychological operations, but a traumatic experience that shaped the rest of their lives. Major General Gambier Parry, captured at Mechili, spent the remainder of the war in prisoner-of-war camps. His military career ended by a defeat that many subsequent analysts suggested could not have been prevented. The soldiers captured alongside him faced years of captivity, separated from families, and removed from the war they had volunteered to fight. The Indian troops who formed part of the garrison faced particular hardships, as prisoners of color sometimes received worse treatment than their white comrades. These human costs of military operations must not be forgotten in analyses that focus on tactical and strategic dimensions. Every military decision, no matter how brilliant tactically or sound strategically, carries human consequences that deserve recognition and respect. The romance of desert warfare, of mobile columns racing across vast expanses, of bold commanders achieving impossible victories, all this obscures the reality of soldiers killed, wounded, or captured, of lives disrupted or destroyed, of trauma that persisted long after the guns fell silent. The fortress at Mechili stands today as it stood in April 1941, silent, empty, unremarkable. The desert has long since reclaimed whatever scars the battle left. No monuments mark where Major General Gambier Parry surrendered to German forces. No plaques commemorate the transformation that occurred when one man's audacity shattered another's certainty. The sand and stone remember nothing. Yet the psychological shockwave that emanated from Mechili on April 8, 1941, reverberated through Allied command structures for years. British generals who had defeated Italian armies with casual efficiency now approached German forces with elaborate caution. Intelligence officers who had accurately assessed Italian capabilities now produced wildly inflated estimates of German strength. Soldiers who had advanced hundreds of miles in Operation Compass now dug defensive positions and waited for an enemy whose movements seemed to defy prediction. This was Rommel's most enduring achievement, not the capture of territory or destruction of forces, but the conquest of Allied commanders' minds. He transformed himself from a newly arrived general into a phantom that haunted every strategic calculation, every tactical decision, every assessment of risk and opportunity. The Desert Fox became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Allied commanders, fearing Rommel's tactical genius, made decisions that validated those fears by ceding initiative and creating opportunities for exactly the kind of bold maneuvers they sought to prevent. But history offers a sobering coda to this tale of tactical brilliance. Rommel won battles throughout 1941 and 1942, yet Germany lost North Africa decisively by May 1943. His tactical victories, achieved through the very methods that triumphed at Mechili, proved unsustainable. Supply lines stretched too thin eventually snapped. Forces pushed too hard eventually broke. Gambles that succeeded against unprepared opponents eventually failed against enemies who had learned from defeat and adapted their methods accordingly. The transformation occurred gradually, but inexorably. At Alam Halfa in August 1942, Montgomery refused to be drawn into the kind of mobile battle where Rommel excelled, instead forcing the Germans to attack prepared defenses where British material superiority could be decisive. At El Alamein in October 1942, overwhelming Allied artillery and air power, combined with carefully coordinated infantry and armor attacks, achieved breakthrough despite Rommel's tactical genius. By the time Allied forces landed in Algeria and Morocco in November 1942, creating a two-front war that German logistics could not sustain, Rommel's tactical brilliance had become irrelevant to the strategic outcome. The deeper lesson of Mechili is not about the power of tactical genius, but about its limitations. Rommel demonstrated that audacity, speed, and psychological warfare could achieve victories against materially superior opponents. But he also demonstrated though the lesson often goes unrecognized, that tactical excellence cannot substitute for strategic wisdom, that victories won through operational brilliance remain vulnerable if they lack sustainable foundations, that reputation itself becomes a trap when it causes commanders to attempt the impossible rather than accept the achievable. For Allied commanders, Mechili taught a different lesson, one learned painfully, but ultimately applied effectively. They learned that respecting an opponent's tactical abilities need not mean fearing them. They learned that material superiority matters only if employed intelligently, but that intelligently employed material superiority ultimately proves decisive against even brilliant opponents. They learned that wars are won not by tactical genius, but by the unglamorous work of logistics, training, coordination, and the patient accumulation of advantages that eventually become overwhelming. In the final accounting, both sides at Mechili achieved Pyrrhic victories of a sort. Rommel won the battle and the psychological advantage that followed, but that very success encouraged the overextension that contributed to Axis defeat in North Africa. Allied commanders lost the battle and suffered a psychological wound that influenced decisions for years, but that wound forced them to develop the methodical, materially oriented approach that ultimately proved decisive. The fortress that fell in April 1941 became a monument to tactical brilliance and a warning about its insufficiency. Perhaps most importantly, Mechili reminds us that warfare exists as much in the minds of commanders as in the movements of armies. The tank that British intelligence sees on a distant ridge is as real to the intelligence officer as the tank that actually exists, and decisions made on the basis of imagined threats produce results as tangible as decisions based on actual threats. Rommel understood this truth instinctively and exploited it ruthlessly. But the same psychological dynamics that gave him advantages eventually constrained him. His reputation made Allied commanders cautious, but also made his own superiors overestimate what he could achieve with inadequate resources. The sun sets over the Libyan desert, as it has for millennia, indifferent to the human dramas that have played out beneath its pitiless gaze. The fortress at Mechili crumbles slowly under the assault of wind and sand, its strategic significance long since evaporated, its historical importance fading as those who fought there pass from living memory to written history to, eventually, footnotes in comprehensive accounts of much larger campaigns. But for those who seek to understand warfare, not merely its tactical mechanics, but its psychological dimensions, its human realities, its capacity to reveal character and test assumptions, Mechili retains enduring significance. Here, in 2 days of April 1941, illusion and reality collided. A commander with limited resources convinced opponents with superior strength that they faced overwhelming force. A garrison that should have held fell almost without fighting. Assumptions shattered, confidence evaporated, and the trajectory of an entire campaign shifted because one man understood that the appearance of strength could be as decisive as its reality. This is why Allied commanders feared Rommel's desert trap after Mechili, not because of what actually happened at that remote fortress, but because of what it revealed about the fragility of military certainty, the power of reputation, and the terrifying effectiveness of a commander who waged war as much with perception as with steel. The trap was never just geographical. It was psychological, strategic, and ultimately inescapable, at least until time, attrition, and the patient accumulation of overwhelming material advantage finally rendered even the most brilliant tactical genius powerless against the inexorable logic of industrial age warfare. The last defenders left Mechili as prisoners on April 8, 1941. But in a very real sense, Allied commanders remained trapped there, trapped by the implications of their defeat, trapped by the legend it created, trapped by the fear it instilled, until the deserts of North Africa themselves ceased to be battlefields and became merely empty spaces under an empty sky, waiting for the next generation of soldiers to rediscover what those who fought at Mechili learned, that in war, what commanders believe often matters more than what actually is, and that the conquest of an enemy's imagination can be more decisive than the conquest of his territory. The legacy of Mechili extends beyond the North African campaign, beyond World War II, into the realm of enduring military truths. It stands as testament to the proposition that psychological factors can be as decisive as material ones, that speed and surprise can compensate for numerical inferiority, that reputation, once established, becomes a force multiplier that affects every subsequent engagement. But it also serves as warning about the dangers of allowing psychological factors to override objective assessment, about the limits of tactical brilliance in the face of strategic reality, about the ultimate futility of victories that cannot be sustained. In the final analysis, Mechili represents a moment when the possible and the impossible seem to exchange places, when a fortress considered secure fell with shocking speed, when a newly arrived commander shattered assumptions about desert warfare, when psychological impact achieved more than firepower. That moment passed, as all moments do, but its effects persisted, shaping decisions and influencing outcomes long after the immediate tactical situation had evolved beyond recognition. Understanding why requires grappling with fundamental questions about the nature of warfare, the psychology of command, and the complex interplay between perception and reality that characterizes military conflict at every level. The empty fortress stands as silent witness to these truths, its crumbling walls offering no answers, only questions for those who seek to understand why battles are won and lost, why some defeats resonate far beyond their immediate tactical significance, and why the name Rommel, decades after his death, still evokes images of desert columns appearing from nowhere, of impossible victories, of a commander who understood that in warfare, the conquest of the enemy's mind often precedes and enables the conquest of his forces. Mechili was where that conquest began, where Allied commanders learned to fear what they could not predict, and where the psychological dimensions of desert warfare emerged as forces as powerful as the physical ones that dominated military thinking. The lessons remain even as the fortress itself returns slowly to the desert that surrounds it, a reminder that in war, as in all human endeavors, perception shapes reality as surely as reality shapes perception, and that the most decisive victories are often those that occur in the mind before they occur on the battlefield.